The topics and opinions expressed in the following show are solely those of the hosts and their guests and not those of W4CY Radio, its employees, or affiliates. We make no recommendations or endorsements for radio show programs, services, or products mentioned on air or on our web. No liability, explicit or implied, shall be extended to W4CY Radio or its employees or affiliates. Any questions or comments should be directed to those show hosts. Thank you for choosing W4CY Radio.
What's working on purpose anyway? Each week, we ponder the answer to this question. People ache for meaning and purpose at work, to contribute their talents passionately and know their lives really matter. They crave being part of an organization that inspires them and helps them grow into realizing their highest potential. Business can be such a force for good in the world, elevating humanity. In our program, we provide guidance and inspiration to help usher in this world we all want, working on purpose. Now, here's your host, Dr. Elise Cortez.
Welcome back to the Working on Purpose program. Thanks for tuning in again this week. Great to have you. I'm your host, Dr. Elise Cortez, joining you live from Dallas, which is home base for me. If we've not met yet and you don't know me, I'm a management consultant, organizational logotherapist, speaker, and author. My team and I at Elise Cortez and Associates help companies enliven their operations by articulating their purpose and building inspirational leaders and cultures activated by meaning and purpose to turn those companies from a flatline EKG to a vibrant workplace. There, people are intrinsically motivated to perform at their best, grow into their fullest potential, and are committed to stay and help deliver on the company's mission. You can learn more about us and how we can work together at elisecortez.com. Now, let's get into today's program. With us is Dustin Staiger. He's the principal partner at The People Brand, where he unearths the heart and soul of his clients' business culture and branding to attract their best customers and employees. He's the author of Blame This Book, Rescue Your Workplace Culture from Toxicity and Scapegoating, which is what we'll be talking about today. He joins us also from the Dallas area. Dustin, welcome to Working on Purpose.
Thanks for having me on, Elise.
Fantastic to have you here. As I told you in our email exchanges and before we got on air, I think you've written a smashing book. I can't believe it's your first book. It's just smashing.
Oh, that's very kind of you. Thank you.
So to kick us off here, I want to situate here what you've done. You've, as we said before, how you managed to actually distinguish blame. I didn't think it would take a whole book to do it, but it did. But you've written a very deeply personal account that it helps us understand blame, its perils, and how we can create cultures to avoid it. So I think it would be great if we can open this conversation with your very first story in the book of how you got fired over an issue of blame.
Yeah, so it was early on in my career. I was working in an advertising agency and had kind of worked my way up to become a creative director at a young age. And the owner of the business was, one day we had been working on a large project, and it was a large catalog for a client. And this is back when you would send out these print files, would go out to film. The film would be made, then they'd etch it onto plates, and then they would print the project. And so we'd gotten through the stage where we had sent everything out to film. It came back and we got what were called proofs at the time before it actually went to press. And we looked at it and there was an issue with every single page of the document. Basically, it was a page numbering issue. And so every single page of that document that catalog was going to have to be re-outputted for film. And it was a very expensive process. And so I had a graphic designer that had made a mistake at that point. But as the creative director, I was also in charge of anything that went out from that side of the art department, basically. And I missed that. I reviewed the artwork. I had missed the numbering issue. And so when it came back, I took responsibility. That's my fault for that happening. That's my role. I needed to make sure that was taken care of. And so it was something that needed to be redone. I talked to the owner of the business about it, and she told me, she said, okay, we'll call the printer and tell them that they need to redo it for free. And I told her, I said, well, this is our issue. We made a mistake. That's not something that I can ask of them. And so we actually ended up in a pretty heated argument over this, which surprised me because I felt like this is not the issue of the printer. This is our issue that we needed to take care of. I worked with the printer without asking them to do anything for free. I figured out a solution that we could output one, instead of outputting, at this point, you would do 3 different colors on a 4-color document. Sorry, there's a lot of inside baseball here, but on printing. But instead of doing all 4 sheets of film, I figured out a way we could actually just replace one sheet of film for each page. That reduced everything by 75%, the cost that we'd have to redo that film. And then, figured out a couple of other things we could do and got a discount from the printer on having that all redone. I went back to the boss. I felt like I'm owning this problem. I'm bringing a solution, and I'm not passing the buck at the same time. And still, the owner was very upset with me, but we went ahead and set that up, sent everything out. That was on a Friday. So over the weekend, still, I'm a little bit upset about everything that happened because there were some, strong words spoken and everything, but kind of worked through everything. Following Monday, show up for work, walk in the back door of the office, and she is sitting at my desk, and she has a little kind of grin on her face, and she just tells me at that moment, "You're fired." And it just completely caught me off guard. And so in this situation, I was willing to take the blame. I wasn't willing to pass the buck, to blame somebody else. And because I wasn't willing to do that, I ended up in a situation where I actually got fired from a job. It turns out it was a toxic workplace. It was someplace that the values of leadership, weren't in line with my own values, but it was a tough pill and a tough lesson to take at that point in my career. And a funny thing is that it's such a great example of a toxic work environment and about a blame culture. And at the same time, I'd written this entire book, got through the entire first draft of the book before I remembered that story, which became something I told at the very, very beginning. My editor was like, "How did you not think of that?"
Right. It's such a great story.
Blame, but yeah. So basically, it's those things that kind of they seem to happen to a lot of people. I've been talking to people all over the country, giving presentations, doing interviews, having people tell me as they read the book, they're like, I had somebody just say the other day, yesterday actually, called me up and we were talking, and he has an industrial company that he's the president of, and he said, have you been spying on our company? This is exactly what.
Maybe.
Yes.
Yeah. Wow. It's just so powerful. And that story was it was perfect to open the book. And I want to say more about that as we go here, but let's first go another level because you just kind of queued it up. You do reference in your book an MIT Sloan Management Review article, a survey by Revelio Labs. It revealed that the toxic work culture was one of the leading reasons that workers were leaving their jobs during the depths of the pandemic, which we called the Great Resignation. So that toxic work culture was more than 10 times more important than compensation in their decision to leave. That's powerful.
It is. And it just shows you how big of an impact this is making. And at a time right now where we've got a war for talent, and it's so hard to attract and engage and retain top talent right now, we're putting in all this effort in trying to attract people into our workplaces. But at the same time, are we really putting in the effort to attend to these toxic work cultures as well? We're just trying to put lipstick on a pig and basically make our workplace look shiny and new, attractive to somebody. But when they get in and they really start to experience it, are we allowing things like blame, a blame culture to, sour the taste? And then we end up becoming a revolving door for that top talent.
Mm-hmm. Indeed. And so you actually, you juxtapose the bad news and the good news in the situation here. The bad news being that we're all addicted to blame. We can all head this direction here. And the good news, of course, being that there is a transformation happening to move away from that. And even the Gallup organization started working on well-being during the pandemic. So can you distinguish just a bit more the bad news and the good news here for us?
Yeah. So, like I said in the book, it really, the bad news is we all wrestle with this, right? This is something that in the book I talk about. There is a creation story at the heart of 3 different religions that are primary, that over 50% of the global population adheres to one of these 3 religions: Christianity, Judaism, and the Muslim faith. So between the 3 of them, they have the story of Adam and Eve, right? And the story of the Garden of Eden. And what happens there is that Eve eats of the forbidden fruit. God tells them there's one thing you can't do, and they do it, right? They eat of the forbidden fruit. Eve does, Adam does. And then in this story, whenever God confronts them, then Adam doesn't take the responsibility. You'd love it to say, okay, well, Adam says, yeah, that's my fault. I'll take responsibility for what I did. And Eve does the same, but he bucks the blame and he blames Eve. This woman did it. She tricked me. And then Eve is there. Like, you got two people in all of creation, according to this story, right? You've got two people in all of creation. So one of them has to take a blame. So now Eve has to, right? No, she takes it. And then she says, the serpent tricked me, right? And so both of them try to blame somebody else for something that they did. And the reason why it's at the heart of, the very, genesis basically of these three main faiths is that it's a habit that is in each and every one of us. It is part of the human condition, basically. So that's the bad news. But the good news is that there are companies out there that are addressing this. There are companies, I have a story about Twilio, which is a company for software developers, and they basically have instated different tools in their corporate culture for doing what's called a blameless postmortem. And so utilizing these tools by looking at objective, root cause analysis and different things, there are companies that are actually saying, hey, there's no room for this emotional overhead of blame and resentment. What can we do to actually take a look at objective facts, do an objective analysis, and then actually do some problem solving on this instead of just trying to find a scapegoat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm also seeing just an elevation of consciousness, and in my latest book, The Great Revitalization, I do talk about how I do believe the world has become more elevated, thanks in part to what we experienced and learned during the pandemic. So I too am seeing some very forward-reaching organizations do some really fantastic things. It's so exciting, so inspiring. So to that end, one of the things that you say in the book, which I really thought was great, and built on what you were just saying there, when it comes to the good news, is how about instead, when a project fails, instead of immediately wondering who did something wrong, what if we ask, what assumptions did we make? Did we miss a step in the process, et cetera, right? So that's back to what you were saying, is looking at this instead of who's to blame here, who's responsible, what's in the system that helped this go wrong. I think that's really, really powerful.
Yeah, and so if you look at, I think it was Deming that said that 94% of all performance variances can be attributed to systems and processes. And so whenever a mistake or a problem occurs, or we have expectations aren't met basically in one way or another, we tend to be really hard on people, right? And we tend to almost ignore systems and processes at the same time. So we're soft on systems and processes, and we're hard on people whenever performance doesn't measure up. And what Deming says is, it's actually, I can't remember what it's like 16 times more likely that it's a process or a system issue. So we need to be hard on our processes and our systems, and we need to be softer with our people in those situations instead. But oftentimes we're doing the exact opposite instead.
Mm-hmm. Which actually brings us right into the next thing here, what I wanted to talk about. You say, what is the number one factor in employee engagement? Positive motivation. And so if we talk a little bit, we distinguish positive motivation from, this is where people actually feel like they matter, that they're seen, they're cared for, et cetera, versus the negative motivation. If you can distinguish that for us, and kind of what happens when people experience that negative motivation.
Yeah. So there's some conversation around, like a while back, Douglas McGregor wrote a book back in the 1960s, The Human Side of Enterprise, right? And so he talked about two different kinds of leadership styles. And he talked about X theory leadership and Y theory leadership, right? And so the X theory leadership is a leader that typically thinks that, you have to stay on top of people. You need to crack the whip. You have to motivate them. When the cat's away, the mice will play, basically. Right. That people, inherently lazy, and unless you really stay on top of them, basically they're not going to get their work done, right? And so, and then the theory Y leader says, okay, well, people inherently want to engage in the work. They want to be fulfilled by the work. And my job as a leader is to remove the obstacles that keep them from being able to do a good job, right? And so I think there's a lot of, there's a place really for both of those theories. I'm not saying that, that the theory X leadership style is completely bad. There are places like there's Amazon fulfillment centers where they really need to stay on top of that. They hire people basically that, that's what they're looking for. They basically want to be told what to do. Short order cooks, or give me an order, I'll make the food. I know I have to do it in a certain amount of time, and there's all different variations of that. But in a lot of workplaces, there are people that they're looking for some autonomy. They're looking for ways. I think Dan Pink talks about autonomy, mastery, and purpose. Right?
He does. Mm-hmm.
That AMP is kind of the acronym that I use to remember that. And that people are fulfilled in the work that they do, and they'll be motivated and they'll be driven, right? Because it's a book called Drive was the name of the book that he said that in. And so if we are able to attend to that, and most people, and you hire the kind of people that's what they're looking for. They're not the kind of people that are just order takers, and that's the kind of culture that you want. It's people that take initiative, and they own the issue, and they engage in that work. Then you need to be more of that theory Y style of leader, and you need to start removing the obstacles that are in people's way instead of micromanaging them instead. And there's we talked about, you probably seen all the surveys around engagement that Gallup does as well. And so you're talking about, typically it's about when those come out, it doesn't seem like the needle has moved very much on engagement.
No, it hasn't.
Yeah. And so you get about what they say about a third in a decent workforce. You got a third of your workforce that's actually engaged. And then you got 2/3 of them that are either not engaged or they're actively disengaged, right? Just 1 out of 3 people being engaged is the standard for excellence. It's like that. It's a really low bar. So what can we do to actually engage people in their work, help them feel fulfilled? And I think it's coming from both sides. It's the leadership wants it, and the workers want that as well. And so what's that gap that's happening? And my thesis in this book is the gap is that, people are afraid. They're afraid of failure, and you hear that a lot. But
yes,
what's behind that is that they're afraid that if they fail, then they're going to be saddled with blame. And so if you can actually do that, if you can actually remove the hindrance that blame creates and blame culture and the fear that creates, then you have people that say, okay, you know what? It's actually okay for us to fail. But as long as we're able to learn from that failure and then to make changes and move forward.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful. Let's let our listeners and viewers stew on that while we take our first break here, just really thinking about the extent to which their own workplaces may have this blame inside their cultures. I'm your host, Dr. Elise Cortez. We've been on the air with Dustin Staiger, the principal partner at the People Brand, where he unearths the heart and soul of his clients' business, culture, and branding to attract their best customers and employees. He's the author of Blame This Book, Rescue Your Workplace and Culture from Toxicity and Scapegoating. We've been talking a bit about his own experience with blame and help in bringing to light just what it looks like, feels like, and does to the bottom line results of an organization and to the hearts of the people. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Dr. Elise Cortez is a management consultant specializing in meaning and purpose, an inspirational speaker and author. She helps companies visioneer for greater purpose among stakeholders and develop purpose-inspired leadership and meaning-infused cultures that elevate fulfillment, performance, and commitment within the workforce. To learn more or to invite Elise to speak to your organization, please visit her at elisecortez.com. Let's talk about how to get your employees working on purpose. This is Working on Purpose with Dr. Elise Cortez. To reach our program today or to open a conversation with Elise, send an email to Elise, A-L-I-S-E, at elisecortez.com. Now, back to Working on Purpose.
Thanks for staying with us. Before we get back into the program, I'm very excited to announce to you the launch of the Purpose and Joy Tour. This is a collaboration with Joyly, an organization that teaches mindful practices to build a happy, healthy, resilient world, and my firm, Elise Cortez & Associates, that exists to awaken people to their passion and purpose and build leadership and cultures that support these efforts. Together, we're going to 33 cities across the United States, starting in Dallas in March and finishing in Virginia Beach in October, to find our tribe and build a community of people who seek to elevate their lives and businesses by cultivating meaning, purpose, and joy. You can find the list of cities, states, and planned events at gusto-now.com/events. Very excited. Hope to see you there. If you're just now joining the program, my guest is Dustin Staiger. He's the author of Blame This Book, Rescue Your Workplace Culture from Toxicity and Scapegoating. I'm your host, Dr. Elise Cortez. So from here, if you would, you have to share this story about, the rest of the story here as this continues to unfold in your life here. You talk about this, quote, snake pit of a professional financial woes that you were experiencing that kicked off your own personal tragedy and resulted in something pretty devastating in your life. Would you situate what was happening for you to help us understand how it is related to what you address in your book around blame and just how that manifests in your life?
Yeah, so this is, something that I struggled with personally. So it's something that's deeply personal to me in writing this book, and even in portions of this book, I was became very emotionally charged for me as I was writing it. And so I came to a moment where we had I had worked my way back into working in the agency world again of marketing and advertising. And my wife and I had taken out some loans and we had invested into a company, and things seemed to be going pretty well. But the company was really centered around the residential real estate market. And this was back in 2006. And we kind of were going like big gangbusters for a while and really growing well as the real estate market was booming. But as a lot of people know, in 2008, with subprime lending and everything, that the bubble popped at that point, and we moved into the Great Recession, and it really impacted our business, of course. And we had customers that just went completely out of business at this point. We had customers that cut way back on their marketing budgets, and so we got to a place where we actually had to close up shop. And basically, I had to find a different job at that point, and which was challenging because we're in the middle of a recession. And so we're in some financial difficulty. We had some medical bills that we had to take care of at the same time. And then we had an issue where it was kind of a snapping point for me, which was that we had a washer and dryer that we had to replace. So we had financial debt that we had to take on for that at that moment. And then whenever we did, the installers did a subpar job of installing the washing machine, and they cross-threaded the water line on it. And so in the middle of the night, we were woken by our young son, who said that the roof was leaking downstairs in our house, and that's never a good thing. So
right.
I had a pretty good idea of what was going on at that point, and so I ran into our laundry room. We had upstairs laundry room, which thankfully we don't have one of those anymore. But basically, the entire laundry room was flooded. Water was spraying from behind the washing machine onto the floor. I walked into several inches of water, and it was pouring through the downstairs ceiling into our dining room, and so we had to get a lot of stuff replaced. I won't go into a lot of details, but we had to fight with the insurance company of the contract installers that had done the work, and weren't able to get 100% replacement for everything, and so we had some financial commitments at that point, which we weren't really prepared for. And so then we find ourselves that we're at a carpet store. We're going to replace the carpet from this incident. And all of a sudden, as we're trying to finalize the price of the carpet and everything that we're ordering with the salesperson, my foot feels like it's asleep. And it's really strange because I'm standing. And typically that happens if you're sitting oddly or something. But standing up, like my foot just doesn't fall asleep. And so I just kind of tap it, but it keeps tingling, and then all of a sudden that numbness kind of has crept up and it's moving up my leg. And I tell my wife, "Is like, there's something going on. This is really weird." She said, "Well, maybe you should call the doctor." And so I stepped outside, called the doctor's office. I'm like, "Hey, should I come by the doctor's office?" And they say, "No, you need to go to the closest emergency room right away." And so I go and I tell my wife this, and at this point, like the numbness is up to my waist, and it's only on the right side of my body, which should have been an indicator. And so luckily there's a hospital about a mile away. We get in the car, drive directly there. As we're pulling in, I am now like numb all the way up to the top of my head, only on the right side of my body. So I, can't feel it when I tap on the right side, and when I tap on the left side, I can't feel it all the way down, each side of my nose, just like there's a line right down the middle of my body. And then as we're pulling into the parking lot, I tried to point out there was a parking spot close to the emergency room, and as I pointed out to my wife and tried to tell her about it, the words come out of my mouth is just garbled. It's like blah, 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 like it just doesn't make any sense. And that's when it dawns on me. It's like, oh my gosh, I'm having a stroke, and so I start to think, wow, this could be it. I mean, strokes kill people all the time. I might not make it through this. And it just, scared me. And so we go in. My wife said, it was all a blur to me at this point, but she said that in triage, they're asking me questions. I'm giving them wrong answers to a lot of stuff. She said I gave a birth date that didn't make any sense. It wasn't my birth date. It didn't relate to anybody else's birth date. And so I'm just very confused and having a difficult time thinking or talking. And so they placed me in a room to observe me and keep an eye on me. And then I get like the worst headache I've ever had in my entire life, just pulsating. And it just continues to get worse. And it reaches a point where it feels like somebody has taken a bicycle pump and stuck it inside my head and started pumping, because it feels like my head is just expanding with every pulse of my blood. And so I'm just in incredible pain. And so the doctors put me on a morphine drip and try to get things under control. It does settle me down some, but they said my legs kept moving, and it just felt like my legs were trying to take me someplace else where I could get away from the pain or something. And I'm continuing to ask them for more drugs. They're like, they told my wife that I was at the maximum dosage that they could give me safely at that point. But eventually I fell asleep under, probably just fatigued from the pain and under the drugs. And my parents were there. My dad told my wife that she could go home and be with the kids. And she went home and she cried herself to sleep that night, because she didn't know when she got back to the hospital the next morning what kind of shape I was going to be in. And then in the middle of the night, I woke up, I stood up, I went into the bathroom in my hospital room. And when I came back out, my father looks at me and he's like, Dustin, what in the world? And I'm like, hey, Dad, and I'm talking normal and everything. It just seemed like at that moment, other than just a little bit of a brain fog, I was perfectly normal. So the neurologist showed up the next morning. They had run some tests. She looked at the results and she said, the doctors thought that you had a stroke, but I looked at your results and there's no brain damage. And even with a mini stroke, you would present some kind of damage. And so then she asked me about headaches and migraines that I had in my history. Turns out I was having frequent migraines, and it didn't surprise her. And she said that what I had was basically a spontaneous hemiplegic migraine. And so what that means is that there's no health history in my family of this kind of thing. So spontaneous is what they say instead of it being hereditary or genetic. And then and hemiplegic, meaning that paralysis that happened on one side of my body. And so it presented as a stroke, basically. That's how severe it was. And I really believe that all that stress that I was under, and then the blame and resentment that I was holding, there was blame that I had for the circumstances we're in, there was blame that I had toward my business partner at the time, and there was self-blame that I had on decisions that I had made that had led us to this place. And all of that stuff had mounted and basically brought me to a point that my body had just shut down and revolted. All that, talk about that snake pit, right? That it had, that venom was building up inside of me. And this is the way that it had all come out.
And that's so powerful. And that's why I had to have you tell that whole story, because I wanted our listeners and viewers to really get present to just how dangerous and this thing is, this blame is. And I want you to also know, Dustin, that I got present, because when I do my research for the books, I usually end up with about 17 to 20 typewritten pages. And I got present with myself where I was also carrying blame and with who. And I want you to know how much that really helped and lifted me. And I could actually start to trace it to maybe some physical stuff that I've been dealing with. So maybe you saved my life, Dustin. Just maybe, I don't know. But I really wanted to make sure that you told that story as you did in the detail that you did, because it really brings to light just how tragic this is and how we must address this stuff in our personal lives and certainly at work where we spend the majority of our lives.
Yep. And it can seem like it's, something that, it's something that's unseen, it's invisible, right? But it can manifest itself in a very physical way as well. And I think it happens a lot more than we realize, manifesting itself and not just in our health, but also in the health of the relationships that we have and damaging those as well.
Mm-hmm. I want to give our listeners a little bit just to kind of reflect on that. So let's go ahead and grab our last break here, and then we'll get into more of the actual application of this. I'm your host, Dr. Elise Cortez. We've been on the air with Dustin Staiger, the principal partner at the People brand, where he unearths the heart and soul of his clients' business culture and branding to attract their best customers and employees. He's the author of Blame This Book, Rescue Your Workplace Culture from Toxicity and Scapegoating. We'll be right back.
Dr. Elise Cortez is a management consultant specializing in meaning and purpose, an inspirational speaker and author. She helps companies visioneer for greater purpose among stakeholders and develop purpose-inspired leadership and meaning-infused cultures that elevate fulfillment, performance, and commitment within the workforce. To learn more or to invite Elise to speak to your organization, please visit her at elisecortez.com. Let's talk about how to get your employees working on purpose. This is Working on Purpose with Dr. Elise Cortez. To reach our program today or to open a conversation with Elise, send an email to Elise, A-L-I-S-E, at elisecortez.com. Now, back to Working on Purpose.
Thanks for staying with us and welcome back to Working on Purpose. I mentioned in the last break that we're launching the Purpose and Joy Tour. The two latest books that I have out that are part of the events of the tour experience are The Great Revitalization, How Activating Meaning and Purpose Can Radically Enliven Your Business. This is for leaders to help them learn how to build and elevate their high-performing cultures and leadership. The other latest book is called Coloring Life, How Loss Invites Us to Live More Vibrant Lives, which helps people who are navigating loss to transform to growth and vitality. If you're just now joining us, my guest is Dustin Staiger. He's the author of Blame This Book, Rescue Your Workplace Culture from Toxicity and Scapegoating. I'm your host, Dr. Elise Cortez. So for this last segment here, Dustin, I just want to pull out a few pieces of your work that I think are really interesting and really build on what we've already covered on the show. So first, scapegoating. So if I read directly from your book, you say many leaders don't grasp the nuance of responsibility versus blame. They believe attributing blame to someone will improve that person's performance in the future. Instead, it creates tension as employees recognize leadership will continue to find a scapegoat, and next time it might be them.
Yeah, so when I talk to folks about this and I talk about, I tell them that we want to eliminate blame, and it makes them a little bit nervous, right? Because they wonder, okay, if we eliminate blame, then how are we going to make sure that people are accountable and make sure that people aren't irresponsible, right? And so I have to let them know that those are three different terms. When you talk about responsibility, it's like, I'm being responsible for the words that are coming out of my mouth right now. And if I say something wrong, I'll take ownership of that, right? So it's ownership of your actions currently. And then accountability is that I let somebody, like I say, my wife, if I say something about her or us or, anything that would embarrass her or whatever, she has a right to hold me accountable to that. And so, accountability is allowing somebody else to make sure that you're being held to that standard. And then what is blame? And so I talk about it in the book that blame really is resentment, and it's a resentment toward someone or something that we hold at fault for a misfortune, right? And so when you view it in that light, you can start to see that, resentment really doesn't have a purpose. And so then you can actually have responsibility and you can have accountability without having to have that resentment on top of all that, which is blame. And that gets in the way. right? And it creates these toxic workplaces. It creates an environment where the employees are just waiting for the other shoe to fall whenever something bad happens. So it's like, well, we had a failure, we had some sort of horrible event. That in itself was bad enough, but now we know there's going to be blame handed out at the end of this, and somebody's going to be on the chopping block, somebody's going to get yelled at, chewed out, whatever, dressed down. And so then, that's the other shoe that's going to fall. And that creates this low level tension within the culture, within the environment. And so then within that, there's all kinds of things that bubble up during that time. And then typically what a leader does is, okay, well, we've got this tension. People feel like something has to happen, and they use blame to kind of be that relief valve during that point, instead of allowing that tension to stay there to some degree and say, okay, there was a failure. Now let's take that tension, and instead of just releasing it with blame, let's point everyone toward what can we do to find a solution. Let's take that energy that's created by that tension and actually focus on problem solving instead of scapegoat.
Mm-hmm. Brilliant. I love how you distinguished all that. That was fantastic. Something else that I thought was really compelling about what you wrote here around the blame contagion here is I appreciate that you say that no one likes to be blamed, and we often have little issue with blaming others. But there's a double standard. You say we want justice for others, but mercy for ourselves. And I thought that was really, really, really powerful to understand that. So if we inadvertently hurt somebody, you say we know what we intended to do. So we give ourselves grace, yet we seek justice when another person errs because we assume their underlying intentions must be malicious. That's really powerful to understand that about ourselves. I do recognize that.
Yeah, there is kind of a paradox of intention, right? That we think that because when we make a mistake, we understand what our good intentions were in that moment. And so we may not harbor ill will toward ourselves in that situation. But when somebody else harms us in some way, we tend not to give them that same grace in that situation. And so, we assume that they have some sort of malicious intent instead. And that's what makes it easier for us to blame others, to resent them, is because we assume their intent instead of actually, giving them a benefit of the doubt or allowing them the opportunity to express their intent.
Mm-hmm. Really powerful. Something there for all of us to look into. Now, this is also really compelling for me too. You talk about how a blame culture can really repel talent, and I thought this was especially interesting. You said before the pressure to perform, and so people are blamed for not performing. So I think it's really interesting. You cite a survey about performance management, and there's data that indicates that employees who feel unfairly blamed or uncredited for success are more likely to quit their job. And in fact, it goes even deeper in that 3 out of 4 workers want to create an I quit video for social media detailing for the entire world the toxic culture they endured.
Yeah, that's powerful, right? I mean, just to think that somebody, in that situation, because either they didn't get credit for something good that they did, or they got unfairly credited with blame in that situation, then they feel like I need to shout this from the rooftops of, what has happened here and let everybody know I'm quitting for X, Y, Z reasons, right? And so there's this, feeling of retribution, basically, that's created. That, and there's a French historian named René Girard, and he had a theory called memetics, and he also had something called the scapegoat mechanism, which is kind of the solution to the conflict that memetics creates. And basically, in these situations, there's violence, conflict that happens, and that one side will inflict some sort of violence or conflict on another side, and then it escalates, and then we need some sort of relief valve, which typically is a scapegoat is found, and that's what diffuses the situation, but it's not a positive way to handle it. And so in these situations where people are unfairly blamed, they feel like I have to respond with in a like manner, right? I need to respond with the same kind of resentment or bitterness or whatever that was shown to me because I got saddled with blame.
What I want to surface for our listeners and viewers from at least my vantage point, you correct me if I don't have this right, but what you're illustrating to me, Dustin, is just the sheer amount of energy, that negative energy that blame can incite. And that energy has to go somewhere. And so when you think about just how powerful, if you can intervene in this stuff in your organization, diminish it, even just somewhat, what a difference that would make. I don't know if it's possible to eradicate it, but anyway, I really am getting very present. And even your own experience, it really illustrates just the power of how strong this stuff is.
Yeah, it's what Walter Wink called the myth of redemptive violence, right? And it's the fact that there is no redemptive violence when you really look at it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, now let's get a little bit more into culture here. I appreciate very much how you distinguish this. And you do talk about it being a grossly overused business buzzword today, and I would agree with you. But I like what you say, though, about this notion of distinguishing that an individual behavior over time is a habit and group behavior over time is culture. That is just so simple and powerful.
Yeah, it's something that I think adds a lot of clarity to what we're talking about when we talk about culture, because it can be an ambiguous term. And so when we look at it and we think about the habits that we have and how when we just change the actions that we take on a regular basis, then that can create new habits. And there's even the book, The Power of Habit by Charles Duhigg. And he talks about you can take the elements of that habit and just replace them with something else, and then take a bad habit and turn it into a good habit, basically. And so in a similar fashion, if you think about organizational culture as, hey, it's group behavior over time, then you can do similar things that you address with your habits. You can address the elements of that group behavior and then change the culture of your organization.
Mm-hmm. And to that end, I really like what you talk about the bias for action, helping companies to move away from blame. Let's hear a bit more about that. That's just so powerful and compelling.
Yeah. So whenever you have a bias for action, then instead of, dwelling on blame and harboring that resentment, you're going to be looking for what can we do to actually solve the problem. You don't have time to deal with that emotional overhead that's created by blame. You don't have time to stew in resentment. You don't have time to look for a scapegoat. You're focused on, okay, what is the action that we can take to remedy this situation? But what can we make sure that this is a positive action, right? That this is an action that's actually going to be a solution, that it's not a pseudo solution. Because one of the things I talk about, I repeat it throughout the book, is that blame is not an actual solution. Blame is a pseudo solution. And what it does is it gives us that false conviction that we've actually solved the problem. And then what we do is we may, fire somebody, chastise them or whatever, and we feel like we've solved it. But what we really have done is we've kicked the can down the road, because as we talked about what Deming said about this typically being a process or systems issue, we're not addressing that, right? Instead, we're finding a scapegoat, and then we're moving on. And then that issue with our processes, that issue that's within our system that's likely there, we haven't addressed it. And so then what happens? Down the road, a similar circumstance comes up and a similar failure happens again. So that's why you have a lot of organizations where they have some sort of failure that occurs, and then they find a scapegoat, and then down the road, that same failure happens. So they're firing people. They have a revolving door of talent, and yet somehow that organization still ends up in the same place they've always been.
Mm-hmm. And this is really powerful too. I like how you say, you take it another step. You say, when you have a bias for action, you're willing to try new things you aren't sure will succeed. Fear of blame opposes that by forcing people to look for guarantees, doing the things that have already been done, things that are proven to work. This imposes the status quo on teams and individuals. So, gosh, you think about, we wonder why why organizations are not innovating. There's no creativity. You've completely stamped it out here with this stuff. I thought that was really powerful.
And you hear it in a lot of organizations because the phrase that they use is, that's not the way we do things around here.
Yes, right. You also talk about, of course, the CYA, the all-important CYA, cover your ass phenomenon that is well known in organizations and well utilized. So we've been talking about how problematic this whole thing is. Let's get toward the end of the show here. We're coming close to the end here. And let's talk about what a blameless future looks like. You actually list 5 things that comprise a blameless future. Let's talk about each one of them, starting with fewer scapegoats. What do we get when we get fewer scapegoats?
Yeah. So, like I talked about earlier, that whenever you use a scapegoat, then that's that pseudo solution, right? And so then you're actually in a situation where you're doing something that's counterproductive, and you're actually not creating a culture of responsibility or a culture of accountability. And so when actually you don't focus on creating a scapegoat, then instead you're going to look at what can we do to actually make sure that people are held accountable for the actual work that they're held to do. And if you're going to do that, you're also going to be looking at what can we do to make sure that we're clear about the responsibilities that people have on the onset of projects, not turning around and scapegoating them at the end of the project instead.
When they've blown up, yeah. Okay, and then the second thing that you talk about in A Blameless Future is fewer pseudo solutions, which leads to?
Yeah, so whenever you avoid those pseudo solutions, and like we said earlier, then now you're actually able to focus on the problems at hand. You're looking at what happened. You're doing an objective analysis of the issues. And so, whether that's a root cause analysis, whether you're doing the 5 whys to really drill down, why did this happen? Why that, to get down to that root cause. Or if you're using a tool like a blameless postmortem to say, okay, what happened in this issue and how can we actually look at this objectively? And we're going to go through this process and look at what actually occurred, what we expected to occur, what was the delta between those two things, and why did that happen? And not in the course of those questions did you hear me say, who's to blame, right? Yeah. That's not the focus of that. Mm-hmm. It is able to find solutions through that objective process.
And then the third piece you put forward in A Blameless Future, which we've already somewhat discussed here, is this notion of less fear. And what does that lead to?
Yeah, so whenever you create fear or blame, then like we talked about earlier, you're going to create a culture that hinders creativity and innovation. It reduces our tolerance for risk, because people are fearful to take that risk, because in the end, they know that they're going to be the scapegoat in that situation if they're the person that is the one that took that risk. And so then people are focused on, hey, what can I do to just do the tried and true? What things have actually worked in the past? And so you're always looking backwards at right. What has worked instead of looking forwards at what can we do differently? What are some tests that we can do? What's a hypothesis that we can test out here? What are some experiments that we can try? And if they fail, it's okay. We learn through that process, and then we can try a more informed experiment down the road. And that's the companies that actually are innovating and are being creative. And that's, in a changing economy like we constantly have, then that's something that is critical for the health of our organizations.
Mm-hmm. And I'll just quickly say the other two, just because we're getting close to the end here. So the less oppression means, of course, more engagement, right? Wow, people are actually they're leaning in to get the work done. What a concept. And then I love this last one, Dustin. It's so beautiful. Fewer toxic workplaces equate to more grace.
Yes.
And I that's the kind of world I want to live in. And that's the kind of place I want to work in.
Yeah, if there's any anti-toxin for our workplaces that we need today, I think it's grace.
Agreed. We ran through the end of the show already, Dustin. The show is listened to by people around the world. They care about building workplaces where people actually want to come to work and do their best, being led by inspirational leaders who bring them to their greatness. And we do business that betters the world. In about 15 seconds, what would you like to leave them with?
Yeah, so I think that, the big thing for me is that I talk about this and we talk about it in the workplace culture, but this is life, right? And so, in every engagement, any place that we have relationships, I think getting rid of blame and removing scapegoats, I think, and being able to replace that with grace, I think that helps us create a better world in general, as cliche as that may sound.
Mm-hmm. So I'm happy to be a soldier with you in that effort. Dustin, and thank you so much for coming on Working on Purpose. It has been a delight to read your book, get to know you, and have you on. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me, Elise.
Listeners, viewers, if you want to learn more about Dustin Staiger and the work he and his team do at The People Brand, go to thepeoplebrand.com. Last week, if you missed the live show, you can always catch it via recorded podcast. We were on air with Lance. Oh, actually, Lance is coming on next week. Last week, we were actually on with Frank Devine, and we were talking about his book, Around Engagement. This next week, we'll be on with Lance Secreton, this time talking about his beautiful latest book, Reawakening the Human Spirit. See you there. And remember, work is an integral and important part of our lives and can be one of the best adventures and means of realizing our potential and making the impact we crave. So let's work on purpose.
We hope you've enjoyed this week's program. Be sure to tune into Working on Purpose, featuring your host, Dr. Elise Cortez, each week on W4CY. Together, we'll create a world where business operates conscientiously, leadership inspires impassioned performance, and employees are fulfilled in work that provides the meaning and purpose they crave. See you there. Let's work on purpose.